June 7, 1917, near Whitchate, the Messines Ridge. Sapper Jack Price presses his thumb against the brass firing switch, holds his breath, and waits for a red signal lamp that does not blink. Underground, he cannot hear the surface guns, only the wet tick of clay droplets sliding down timbers. Somewhere on the other end of a waxed cable, buried in blue clay beneath German positions, sits a chamber of a monal big enough to erase a street. He nods once to the runner beside him, then squeezes. 19 mines detonate almost as one. The ridge heaves. Earth climbs and falls. British infantry in the assembly trenches feel it pass through their ribs like a hand slapping a drum. German pickets vanish into light and dust. The blast throws debris high enough to look like a second dawn. In seconds, the front changes shape. In minutes, it becomes a different map. An eyewitness calls it a horizon of volcanoes. The figures that follow will make sense of that line, but not soften it. The ridge had mattered for 2.5 years. Not because it was beautiful, though from the slope you could see the spires of yippers and a collar of farms, but because it was higher by tens of meters than the flooded flats below. Whoever owned Messines Ridge could look into the salient, could observe batteries, spot supply columns, and rake approach routes from 3 sides. In 1915 and 1916, British assaults here failed at catastrophic rates because ground and geometry were wrong. Mud-swallowing movement, German artillery with the angles, machine guns with interlocking arcs, and the British line bent into a horseshoe that absorbed punishment with nowhere to go. In 1917, the plan was different. Lieutenant General Sir Herbert Plumer's Second Army would not shoulder forward on a broad front until exhaustion set the pace. He chose a narrower bite, a clean set of limited objectives on the ridge itself, and then hold. The bite-and-hold tactic would be made literal by men who never saw daylight on shift. They would cut the ridge from below. The geology was the true ally and the true enemy. Under Messines lay a stubborn belt of London clay, blue, dense, plastic, over sand and chalk. Men with clamps to mute their boots, with lamps hooded to a pinprick, pushed galleries out from British lines at a pace measured first in meters per week, then meters per fortnight when German counterminers drew near. They cut through clay with picks wrapped in sacking. They used bayonets as knives when sound had to be shaved thinner. They worked in pairs and fours, one digging, one filling sandbags, 2 lying prone with copper diaphragms pressed to their skulls, listening for other men in other tunnels who were listening for them. It was a war in a second medium. The numbers tell the shape of this second front. Over 2.5 years, British and Dominion tunneling companies drove dozens of galleries beneath the German line from St. Eloi down to Plugsteert Wood, some galleries reaching more than 600 meters from their start shaft, most no wider than a doorframe. They unloaded hundreds of tons of ammonal into chambers carved in a series beneath strong points with names that had become fixed on trench maps: St. Eloi, Hooga, Hill 60, The Caterpillar, Kruiststraat, Ontario Farm, Petit Bois, Madelstede, Peckham, Spambrook-Molen, and others. Each chamber was not a room, so much as an earthen lung plugged with explosive and tamped with chalk bags to throw force upward. Men rotated in the dark in a rhythm as strict as any on the surface. 8 or 12 hours at a time, air rancid with candles and bodies, a steady drip from overhead. Carbon monoxide when ventilation faltered. Flooding when rain found a seam. German camouflage charges that collapsed galleries in an instant to produce a vacuum that sucked men into the failure like a hand taking bedsheets away. On bad days, there was no noise at all, just a soft settling. Then the timber creaked, and an entire section of tunnel slipped 3 inches, as if the earth had just swallowed saliva. On worse days, the earth coughed and did not stop, everything trembling, everything too soft. The men had names that became shorthand for roles older than the names. The 171st, 175th, 250th Tunneling Companies of the Royal Engineers, the 1st Australian Tunneling Company holding Hill 60 and the Caterpillar in the crucial final year. Canadian tunnelers who had cut and fought at St. Eloi, specialists who carried stethoscopes to place on clay and lips to place on wall, making their own ears into instruments. They wrote home in short notes that smelled of lamp oil. They cut through a medium that remembered every touch. They made a battlefield that would not show itself until it moved. The Germans knew, of course. You cannot live in the ground and fail to feel it shifting. German miners dug their own counter-tunnels, dropped their own camouflets, and built listening posts with delicate geophones and men even more patient than the British. They set traps. They waited. In 1916 and early 1917, dozens of underground fights took place. Small charges to collapse British galleries, spurs dug to intersect enemy tunnels at a right angle and break through with revolvers and grenades. There was a logic to the distance. Keep your tunnel at least 5 meters below the enemies if you could. The clay would transmit sound, but the distance might give you 1 more hour. It was a duel that demanded the same quiet you needed to survive it. Above ground, Plumer assembled a different grammar of modern fighting for the day the tunnels would speak. He registered more than 2,000 guns and heavy mortars. He trained observers to talk in code about fall of shot and corrections, and he mapped enemy batteries with flash spotting at night and sound ranging by day, triangulating gun positions with microphones spread like a net across the forward area. He ordered a creeping barrage that would move by strict schedule ahead of his infantry, at times as slow as 46 meters per minute, to keep German heads down and push defenders away from the lip of each crater. The timetable was precise. The mines were fused to seconds. The barrage would step off on the minute. The infantry would walk behind the barrage, not run. A machine too big to be seen would turn all its cogs together at 3:10 a.m. and keep turning. There is a line attributed to Plumer that survives because it captures that sense of granularity. Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we shall certainly change the geography. He was not talking about an abstract shift. He was speaking of cubic meters of displaced earth, of the way the ridge itself would be rearranged. The ridge that had defeated attacks would become a slope that offered cover. The strong points that had survived shellfire would be lifted out of the problem entirely. It was an inversion of the usual assault logic. Instead of reducing bunkers by direct fire or overrun, remove the ground they sat on. Not a blunt hammer blow, but a subtraction. As May 1917 crossed to June, the underground began to take on the feeling of a coiled spring. The last explosive bags were carried into chambers and stacked in careful pyramids. Leads were tested. Detonators were laid out along boards hand-lettered with the names of target farms and woods. The miles of cable leading back to the firing points were protected in sand and clay, where men would hunch, strike a match, and look down to see if their own shaking hands would make the flame shake too. The British believed some of the German listeners had located parts of the system. Several mines had already been destroyed by German countermoves, and foul water had flooded more. 3 charges at a salient called the Birdcage were left unfired in the end. That subtraction would come later, years later, but the day itself had more than enough remaining. Night held a kind of breath before dawn at Messines that morning. The shelling slowed to a whisper, then stopped. There was stillness so complete that a single skylark above the British forward line seemed too loud. Sappers stared at dials and watched for that red lamp that would make everything that followed a matter of seconds and wait. The British infantry stood up in their trenches and shook their legs to wake them. German sentries peered across a place they had learned to read by pattern. There is always a clue when an attack is coming, always 3 clues if you have the patience, but they did not have a clue for what came next. The first mine to go left a circle of flame. The largest, Spanbrook Molen, the Lone Tree Crater, threw up a column of earth 80 meters across and more than 15 meters deep where it came down. Krustraat, Peckham, St. Eloi, Ontario Farm, Petit Bois, Madelstede. The names rolled across the ridge in a wave of earth. The number that holds the scale is simple. More than 450 tons of explosive fired beneath 19 separate objectives. What does that mean in human and military terms? It means a frontage that had taken 2 years to fortify was shattered in 2 minutes. It means German frontline companies vanished without issuing their first SOS flare. It means the machine gun nests that had chained earlier attackers to the ground were now inverted craters with the guns nowhere to be seen. It means the creeping barrage that followed stepped off on time onto defenders who were stunned, disorganized, or dead. The shock was physical, cognitive, and systemic. Physical, German troops thrown from dugouts that had seemed deep enough to endure even heavy shells. Cognitive, commanders who had been trained to read artillery pauses as feints suddenly confronted a problem for which there was no drill manual. 3 kilometers of their front had changed shape and could not be restored by signaling. Systemic, a line of communication built on buried cables and runners, was cut in a single instant across multiple sectors. Responses lagged not by minutes, but by an order of systems that had lost their geometry. British, Australian, New Zealand, and Irish infantry moved. Some moved as drills had taught them, in skirmish lines behind the creeping barrage, weapons at port, eyes on the shell bursts ahead. Others moved without waiting, because the ground was speaking a faster language. Where a machine gun was supposed to be, there was nothing. Where the wire was supposed to fret and advance, there were only strands laid down by the blast. Platoon leaders looked for landmarks and did not find them, because the landmarks were now pits with steep walls. At Whitchate and Messines villages, resistance hardened around surviving concrete pillboxes, but even there the choreography had changed. The approaches were masked by crater lips, and the time window before German artillery could recenter was larger than it had ever been. By 05 a.m., messages coming back to 2nd Army headquarters found a rhythm. All first objectives taken, prisoners coming in by the hundred, counter-battery fire effective, German SOS rockets rising sporadically but too few, too late, too far to rearward. After years in the salient, there was a day when cause and effect chains worked as the planners had drawn them on paper. Mines lift the front, barrage steps off, infantry cross what would have been killing ground, counter-battery fire keeps German guns blind, reserve waves take the next line, strong points isolated and surrendered when flanked. The German reaction, once formed, was not cowardly or chaotic so much as out of phase with reality. Local commanders gathered what they could and launched counterattacks into zones where the British barrage still moved. Troops displaced by the blast massed in woods that did not conceal them from new vantage points now held by the attackers. Long-range guns answered, and answered hard, but the British had rehearsed congestion avoidance on their approach roads. Supply kept up, stretcher bearers kept moving, and communication stayed alive because linesmen and runners were feeding the machine by a schedule that had been tested, logged, and then simplified. There is a temptation to declare the mines the sole difference maker and to stop. That would be wrong. The mines were the opening chord of a piece for an orchestra assembled over months. The next movements were a creeping barrage that did not falter, counter-battery work that had silenced an unusually large proportion of German guns by the first hour, and infantry tactics tuned to the destroyed ground. Platoons armed with more light machine guns than in 1916, more rifle grenades, and a doctrine for bypassing stubborn points to keep the pace of advance aligned with the barrage. But the mines made the rest possible at the speed it occurred. They acted like a reset button pressed on terrain and psychology at once. Look down now upon one small scene at Hill 60, just south of the Ypres-Menin road. There, months before, the first Australian tunneling company had inherited a tangled inheritance, old British and German galleries, flooded sections, and unexploded charges. They worked through clay that sometimes turned to soap under their hands. They placed charges under 2 high points, Hill 60 itself and a knoll called the Caterpillar. Early on June 7th, both went. The Caterpillar charge lifted and folded a section of the German line, opening a gap through which attacking units poured before the clock had counted 60. Men who had listened for the Germans in the dark now climbed out from shafts to see daylight exaggerated by dust. They saw their work proven in the first no-man's land they could cross without being shot to pieces. Not all of them. Some stayed below to check cables, to make certain no chambers had failed in ways that would later kill someone trying to clear them. The discipline of the underground did not relax just because the surface had roared. Draw back to the ridge's center at Whiteshady, where the German Fourth Army had built heavy defenses because it knew the view they protected. The village fell by mid-morning. Messines fell next. The line had pivoted, but this time in the attackers' favor. The crest that had fed the German guns was no longer theirs. Prisoners carried something in their faces other than simple fear. Surprise that broke into anger, then into a stunned silence. Some had been in their dugouts reading by candlelight because the bombardment had lulled, then gone quiet. A page flipped before the sentence was finished. They heard a low, growing sound, and then they did not hear it because everything else came first. The flash, the pressure, the feeling that the earth itself had contracted and then exploded outward. The statistics that closed the midday loop look like this. By June 14th, the operation had achieved all its ground objectives. The ridge was in Allied hands across a front of roughly 10 kilometers. Prisoners taken ran into the thousands across multiple corps areas. British and Dominion casualties were the typical price of First World War success, tens of thousands over a week of fighting, but significantly fewer in proportion to ground gained than earlier in the salient. German casualties were heavier and skewed toward men who had been in the lethal zone at 0 hour. Crucially, the British line now sat on the observation points that had tormented Ypres since 1914. Every shell fired in the late summer battle to come, 3rd Ypres, would be fired from a map reshaped at dawn on June 7. Move backward in time, as if cutting in a flashback to return, because the true shock of that morning only makes full sense if measured against 1915, when underground war around St. Eloi gave more chaos than order. Back then, British mines would blow, British troops would rush forward, and then British artillery would lift too soon or too late. German counterattacks would materialize in the chalk fog, and the crater edges would become new lines that no one understood. The geometry of craters is a trap if you haven't planned for it. The lip that hides you hides the enemy. The bowl that shields you from fire also restricts your movement. Trying to hold a string of pits connected by narrow paths is like trying to defend a coastline with too few boats. The pictorial map of 1915-1916 was a necklace of disasters strung through mud. What changed by 1917 was not just size, though size did change in the weight of charges and in the number lit at the same moment, but the integration of underground, gunnery, and infantry movement. Plumer's staff obsessed over the intervals between these components. How long after the last crater lifts should the barrage begin? How fast should it move once the defenders have been shocked? How far should the initial objectives go before you pause to defeat counterattacks with planned fires? And where should the second wave begin so that it does not get lost in crater fields that did not exist at sunrise? They built tables that matched uplift to schedule, and then matched schedule to line of sight and communications. The elegant word for this is orchestration. The brutal one is control. Now return to the moment of shock again, from the German side. Picture Lieutenant Ernst Hasse, a company officer in a forward strongpoint near a farm that had seen its name translated and retranslated across staff maps until it had little relation to the place on the ground. He has been awake for 2 nights, watching the British bombardment shift and settle, noting the difference between disruptive fire and the carefully stepped registration that always means an attack is within a day. He has sent word back that he believes an assault is coming on June 7th or June 8th. He has checked his rifles, his ammunition belts, his flare pistols, and the cable that runs to Battalion HQ. He stands on a duckboard at 3:09 a.m. and sees nothing unusual. At 3:10, he sees nothing at all. He has the sensation of being lifted. He stops being a named point on a staff map. Behind him, phone operators hear silence that is not the silence of a line cut by a shell. It is the silence you get when you try to call a place that has ceased to be a place. Shock changes decisions, which change outcomes. German reserve battalions were not where they would have been had this been a standard artillery lift and infantry assault. They were farther back because the British had learned to shell close reserves to thin them. They marched, but into artillery that massed faster than they could. The German artillery that did reply concentrated on lines it knew, but those lines were being occupied by British troops moving on a timetable previously unworkable in the salient. Artillery cannot answer a dislocation it does not detect. And German countermining units listened hard but had no relief to offer now. Their expertise was for the hours before 0, not the minutes after. There is a mid-story reversal that closes an open loop. For months, rumors had filtered through both sides about the scale of mining. Stories told around braziers and in dugouts always add weight, always multiply numbers. They've got 200 tons under Witschati, a German sapper might say, meaning he had heard a rattle through the wall and interpreted it through fear. They're going to blow us to Lille, a British infantryman might answer, because distance is a measure of anxiety, not carts and measures. On June 7th, the system validated the rumor. The actual number of tons lay between rumor and impossible, and it was enough. The real reveal was not just that the British could put mines under almost every significant feature on the ridge, it was that they could fire them in a single mathematical moment and then exploit the shape they made. Short, declarative lines, because the pattern is clear now. The ridge fell because the ground moved. The ground moved because men tunneled. The tunneling succeeded because geology allowed it and planning demanded it. The planning worked because artillery, infantry, and communications were aligned to the second. The defense failed because it was surprised not in the ordinary way of miscalculated time, but in the extraordinary way of losing the thing it defended, the ground itself. Thesis in one line. At Messines, the British did not simply attack the German front, they deleted it and wrote a new one. Consequences run forward in time like echoes. The capture of the ridge in June set the stage for the Third Battle of Ypres that began in late July. Every British gun that could now see over the flats toward Passchendaele did so because of a morning when craters became observation posts. Every German gun that had used the ridge to register on Ypres now had to find new angles under pressure. The psychological effect radiated beyond the front. German command diaries in June carry a sharper tone of alarm around the salient, and British headlines, while careful, finally had a success to set against the long stagnation. Men who had spent their war pushing uphill into fire looked out from the return slope at Messines and understood that the world could tilt the other way. The underground consequences were stranger and slower. Not all mines fired. Some lay deep under fields, wires cut or primers damp, and slept. Farmers plowed above weight they did not know, then learned. In later decades, lightning found a buried cable and triggered what had been meant for a dawn in 1917. A charge went up with no infantry to follow, no barrage to cover. Others were found and diffused with surgical care. Others remain a caution printed on modern maps. The craters that did blow filled with water and became ponds, their circular geometry a constant answer to the question, where was the front? You can walk their rims today and count seconds. 1 for the press of a thumb on a switch, 2 for the flick of a lamp, 3 for a surface that changed. There is a final human reckoning to make, less tidy than a timeline. The tunnelers who survived were not statues of triumph. They were men with coughs that lasted, with a tendency to sleep in rooms with doors open, with a startle response to minor noises out of all proportion. Underground, a rumor that someone was smoking could get you killed. On the surface, a rumor that you had relaxed would shame you. They joked about the smell of the clay that had kept them alive and buried their mates. They did not joke about the silence in which the dead were left when a gallery was sealed, because rescue would bring more death. Some wrote about the night before June 7th, like a night before a verdict. Others did not write about it at all. You can measure success in maps. Their measure was time lived after. German survivors of the front that morning spoke of being astonished. Astonishment has a shape in military history. It is the moment when what you believed about the enemy's capacity is recalibrated in an instant. At Messines, astonishment meant that German calculations about the defensive sufficiency of depth and concrete and fieldworks were shown to be incomplete. You can build shells into your plan. You can build mines into your fear, but only in the way rumors do. You cannot build a ridge into your future if it is no longer there. Astonishment became adaptation by the end of 1917, more depth, greater dispersion, more elastic defense. But at Messines, the first response was the simplest: silence, then confused fire, then surrender when flanked, then an attempt to retake ground that no longer served the same purpose it had on June 6. The operational ledger for Messines is neither simple victory nor miracle. It is a case study in what happens when patient systems are allowed to mature. From late 1915 to mid-1917, British and Dominion units learned to coordinate underground with surface in ways that turned one morning into a change of slope. They learned to take rumor and make it math. They learned that large explosions are not decisive by themselves, but decisive when mated with a timetable and doctrine that folds shock into motion. Their opponents learned too late for Messines, but in time to make Passchendaele hard again. Return to the opening image. Sapper Jack Price's thumb on the brass switch, the red lamp that did not blink because, in the final version of the plan, the firing was done by dry batteries in dugouts with a clear line of sight. The detail is less important than the act it encodes. A hand pressed a switch. A signal ran down a wire wrapped in gutta percha and cloth. A detonator snapped. Clay and chalk tamped the force upward. The ridge rose. The surface of the war changed. Not by heroics in a single trench, but by a system that dug and mapped and measured until it could afford, for one dawn, to trade time for certainty. Not through reckless charge, but through precise subtraction. Not by ignoring the ground, but by rewriting it. The craters on Messines Ridge are the punctuation marks of that realization, full stops placed in a line that had run on too long. After the roar, the silence. After the surprise, the new map. After the new map, the slow understanding that for once, the arithmetic of modern war had added up to something other than stalemate.